telling his just one paragraph telling about his story of seeing or being involved in a UFO crash, and so that I could now compare that with what he said. But I found the original story that appeared in the MUFON Journal, and that's another good thing about it. I mean, if you've got a case you're interested in, you can type it in the search engine, and it'll bring up all references to it. So it helps you, I guess, advance your research. No matter what your research happens to be, if you've got a keyword you can plug in, or the name of a witness, then you can find if anything has been published about that witness in the MUFON Journal.
And I think that's really kind of cool that you can go back to see if their story has stayed consistent or if it's changed dramatically, been embellished, enhanced over time.
Well, you know, and I'm sure you know this, having done your research as well, that as people tell their stories, and each time you access a memory, you may subtly change it. You're not consciously making up lies or anything like that, but each time you tell the story, you've accessed the memory, you may have colored it with other information that you've learned over the years or whatever. So the story may change subtly. And we have to understand that what the guy said in 1968 may be subtly different, and that's the key, subtly different than what he says in 2008. But what I found with the Willingham testimony for the Del Rio crash is what he said in 1968 was radically different than what he said in 2008. And looking at that, you got to say, well, there's a real problem here. It raises some real red flags that we need to resolve.
So what was, since you're bringing up this crash, what was it? I never heard of it, so I'm sure a lot of the listeners haven't heard of it.
Well, if they're into UFOs, they've heard of this one, and it's not as famous as the Roswell crash, where if you've not even into UFOs, you've heard of the Roswell case. But this was a case that was mentioned in the MJ-12 documents that came out in the mid-1980s, and there was what was called the Eisenhower briefing document, which supposedly talked about Roswell, and then it mentioned in a single paragraph this crash that supposedly took on December 6, 1950, near Del Rio, Texas, just across the border in Mexico, as a matter of fact. And it was seen by an Air Force pilot, and he landed, he went back to his base, got a private plane, went back and landed, and couldn't get close to it to see what was going on. The Mexican authorities stopped him. But the problem with the case is, in 1968, the first mention of it, he talked about having seen 3 objects, and he talked about one of them crashing, and he talked about how he had not been able to get close because of the Mexican authorities, and that it happened in 1948. Well, then he meets up with Todd Zeckel, who was a UFO researcher, and he produced a affidavit about this. And the reason a lot of people accepted the story is the guy claimed to be a retired, high-ranking Air Force officer. We're not going to have a colonel making up a story like this because it's going to jeopardize his credibility, if nothing else, make him look like an idiot. But the story changed. Now, as I was putting together the crash book, and I had mentioned the Del Rio case and other things I'd done, suggesting this was a solid case, and I based it solely on the idea that the witness was a retired Air Force colonel. So I thought, as I was putting together the book, well, maybe I ought to see if there's anything new, and I found out that the story had changed again. Now it didn't happen in 1950, but it happened in 1955. Well, maybe it was 1954. Well, it could have been 1957. And he wasn't chasing 3 objects. He was now flying chase for a bomber. And he wasn't flying F-94s, as he said in 1968. He was now flying F-86s, I think it was. And so I began looking deeper into the story, and I asked the various people who have taken this to heart. I said, well, did you check the guy's military credentials? And they all thought that Zeckel had done it. So they said, yeah, it's good. Zeckel checked it. So I had no documentation for that, so I checked out his military credentials. I could find no evidence the guy was ever an officer in the military. He was an officer in the Civil Air Patrol. Well, the Civil Air Patrol is an auxiliary of the Air Force, but it's a civilian auxiliary, and they do wonderful work on search and rescues. If a private plane goes down or turns up missing, the Civil Air Patrol launches the search. It takes a great burden off the Air Force, and it puts a trained professional corps of people in the air searching for it. In fact, when we had the floods in 2008 in here in Iowa, which was a major disaster for Iowa, equivalent to Katrina in New Orleans, in the widespread destruction that was done. The Civil Air Patrol was working in the National Guard headquarters here, and they had a real function in that, and they provided some very valuable assistance in dealing with the flood. So, don't get me wrong, the Civil Air Patrol is a wonderful organization, but this guy had never been an Air Force officer. He'd been a Civil Air Patrol officer, which is not really the same thing. And he said that he had been injured badly in Korea during the war, and that they wouldn't allow him to fly in the Air Force anymore, so he joined the Air Force Reserve, and they put him into fighters. Well, I asked some of my friends who are Air Force fighter pilots about this, because that didn't make sense to me. And they said, no, what normally happens if you're injured that badly and you cannot withstand the rigors of ejection, a fighter ejection system, then you'll be transitioned into another aircraft. You might become a transport pilot, or you might become a bomb pilot if they're not using ejection systems in there, because they're afraid that the rigors of ejection would injure you even more. So he was saying that he couldn't fly combat missions for the Air Force, so he joined the Air Force Reserve, but he stayed in the fighters, and that just isn't right. That doesn't happen that way. That was another problem. I could find no record that he went to flight school, even though I talked to the various flight schools, the Air Force flight schools, and asked about their records, and they couldn't find his name anywhere. I looked through the registries, and his name wasn't there. And he claimed that in 1973, the big fire in St. Louis, which is the excuse that all the pretenders use, well, my records were burned up in St. Louis. They sent me records, but he had been a low-ranking enlisted man in the Army at the end of World War II, from December of 1945 through January of 1947. The war wasn't officially declared over until the middle of 1946, so if you were in the service in December of 1945, you were considered a veteran of the Second World War.
Right.
Now, obviously not a combat veteran. So I could find none of this stuff, but there's other sources of records, which is there's a big reserve center in Denver which would have records, the VA would have records, and this guy didn't retire until 1973, so his records wouldn't have been there to burn up anyway. So this case, I believe to be a hoax now based on that, and I hesitate to say that only because there are two fellows, Noah Torres and Ruben Uriarte, who had put together a book on this, and they, of course, like the rest of us, had believed what Willingham was saying, and I feel sorry for these guys who were taken in by this, because I got taken in myself by a couple of witnesses on the Roswell case, so I understand what they're going through, and it's certainly not their fault. They thought somebody else had checked the guy's credentials, but nobody ever had. So that's a case I think that we can pretty well write off now.
So let me ask, this is the one, now that you've talked about it, this is the one that something supposedly crashed right over the border, and they tried to get to it, and then it disappeared, but they think the government came in the middle of the night and took it, and blah, 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 blah.
Well, but not necessarily disappeared. What happened was, in the first version of the story, he couldn't get close to it. The Mexican authorities kept him away from it. In the second version of the story, he got much closer, and he he picked up a piece of debris that he took home with him and had it checked at a laboratory in Hagerstown, Maryland, I believe it was. And then when he went back to see what the analysis was, they said, "Oh, we don't have it. We don't know what you're talking about." And the guy he supposedly gave it to, well, he doesn't work here anymore. And then in the next version of the story, he's coming out of a different Air Force base. He's in a different location. He's flying different aircraft. But there is absolutely no other witnesses available. Everybody that could corroborate the tale, which differs from Roswell, is unavailable to us, meaning most of them are dead. In the Roswell case, you say, well, Jesse Marcel said this, and you could say, well, Jesse Marcel, for whatever reason, might have been a liar. I don't believe that, but you could say that. But the problem you run into is, well, then what about Patrick Saunders, who was the base adjutant? Is he a liar, too? What about Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, the top cop on the base, who told me it was extraterrestrial? Is he a liar, too? What about, any number of Walter Hott, who was the base public affairs officer? Is he a liar, too? I mean, you can go down the whole